I'm here at Speaker's Corner. It's Sunday the 4th of April and it's quite windy. Here you get an idea just the amount of people who are in the park, which is very, very few. But you must remember that Hyde Park is a very central area and it doesn't tend to have, you know, that many people who live directly around the area. It's generally on the eastern side, it's a very wealthy area, and in the southern side it's really Knightsbridge, again a very wealthy area. A lot of people who have residences there don't actually live there. And over here, you know, you've got Tony Blair and people like that, some very wealthy people, and then a lot of hotels. And further on the other side, Kensington Gardens, you have a bit more of a transient audience, inhabitant base. Now, I'm here today really just to give a rough summary of some of the events taking place this week and the ideas being circulated and the dynamics of the crisis as it develops. I'll start off with the most preposterous and absurd, which just illustrates the utter incompetence and malicious manipulation of the news and information by the British government. The British government is probably, within the advanced capitalist countries, has probably performed the worst of all governments in the world. And that includes Donald Trump and the United States of America. Unfortunately, we now have a very rapidly escalating death rate in Britain. And in order to cover their arses, to cover up for what they've been doing, for their incompetence, for their complete lack of action when the matter was urgent, they are now trying to present the general public, in other words here, these people in the park or, you know, the cyclists going past. And yesterday there were people sitting in the park in Brockwell. There were people in the park in Brockwell Park yesterday sunbathing, and now they've closed the park, and they also seem to be, well, they've sealed off parts of Hyde Park here, so it looks like they might be intending to try and limit the amount of space available to people to use in the park. And Matt Hancock, he reappeared this week and spoke at the government briefing. They call it a briefing. At the government briefing, after 1 week in isolation, after having been tested positive for COVID-19. Now, there are numerous studies which have shown that those who are infected, even though 7 days is the time in which you normally would recover, you can also be infectious and return to infection up to 14 days and possibly longer. There are cases, many cases in China, and there are reports. I mean, it's not magic to find this out. You can look on the medical reports on the internet. You look up Google Scholar, and then you look up duration of illness. And the recommendations almost everywhere are that you would remain after your initial symptoms at least 14 days and probably in most cases 28 days before you would be definitely defined as no longer having the virus. Now, in other words, Matt Hancock, Health Secretary, and his cohort, all the other people who got infected, the Health Secretary, the Prince of Wales, the Prime Minister, and the Chief Medical Officer of England, Chris Whitty, all of them, you know, I mean, better said, Matt Hancock, who's come out of his isolation after having confirmed with having the disease, then goes out into the public, re-engages in his work when he himself may well still be infectious. It beggars belief, the activities of these people. And then they say, madness on madness, that they've always been guided by the science. In fact, the evidence shows, and you just do a little bit of a searching, Google Scholar, duration of infection, and you will see that the evidence from many, many samples around the world shows you cannot assume someone has fully recovered and cannot pass on the virus after 7 or 8 days. Now, Okay, so maybe, you know, he's a magic man, and he isn't. Medicine doesn't. Medical laws don't apply to our government, nor does science, by the way, because probably the best. I'm lucky that I speak German. I'm half German. Probably the best public information sources, other than the Chinese, but I'll deal with the Chinese shortly. It's a different methodology in China. But other than the Chinese, it's actually the Germans who have had the best public information campaign during this crisis. And by the way, the Germans, of course, have one of the lowest rates of death in the whole of Europe. And it's not an accident, because basically when they say to the British people, and I just drove around parts of London, and when they say to the British people, you know, these big signs, you know, stay at home, save lives. Well, this is just not a fact. It's got no connection to reality at all. There is no evidence that people sunbathing in the park, or people walking in the park, or people wandering around the park, or, you know, God knows what. There's no evidence that going to the park has infected anyone in the world. None. The only times when you can get infected in a park is when, for example, you have a very tight congregation of people, such as, for example, Speaker's Corner might be on a busy day, when lots of people are crowded together in very close proximity for a relatively long period of time. But even then, it is quite difficult to catch the virus in the open air. Now, there are studies about this now. It's not like it was in China in January, when no one knew what the dissemination mechanism was. You know, in the 1850s, when there were cholera outbreaks in London, people used to assume, just like in earlier times in the plague and all this sort of thing, they used to assume that, and the medical advice at the time was that the disease spreads in the miasma, just in the somehow or other in the air. And, you know, we could assume for various ailments that that's the case, because you don't know, because it's spreading so fast, because lots of people are getting it. And so a lot of people think, well, maybe it's true, it's just in the air everywhere. And in China, everyone wore a mask. Well, they wore a mask for a couple of reasons, and let me just deal with that first of all. I'll come back to the German issue. The Chinese wore masks because, one, they had the SARS epidemic in 2003, so they had experience of this. And they also, in Wuhan and in the big cities in China, people live in giant tower blocks. In many of these tower blocks, they have maybe 3,000 people living. And these 3,000 people, it's like a ship. And ships are the main carriers, if you like. We've got instances of, for example, the cruise ships around the world where one person gets ill and, you know, huge swathes of the ship come down ill, even when they're stuck in their room most of the time. That's because it's contained air or circulated by some sort of air conditioning system. And there was a study in China that showed one particular case where they monitored him on a bus, and they saw that many people on the bus caught the virus from one person. They know exactly who the person was who was carrying it, and they were up to, I think it was 4.5 meters away. But that was because the air conditioning system inside the bus was circulating the virus inside the bus. Now, and someone caught it even half an hour after that person who originally had it left the bus. So it's enclosed spaces. Now, Sadiq Khan is the mayor of London. I mean, if you look at the New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, and you compare him with the mayor of London, it makes me feel sick. It makes me feel sick that the Labour Party has a representative in power in London who has done nothing except kill, and that's the truth of the matter, he killed a number of tube workers and many Londoners as well through his policy of maintaining the tubes open, of maintaining the buses open. They were packed until a couple of weeks ago, packed to the brim, and there were even some tubes in London packed this week, by the way, after the lockdown took place. And so Sadiq Khan, and today Sadiq Khan was saying, oh, five bus workers have died. how tragic. Well, it's tragic because you are responsible for them dying. Now, the British government as a whole, why are they blaming the people now for going to the park? Why are they trying to turn, the most insipid, vulgar, poisonous minds against people who perhaps have have a small apartment? They require some fresh air. They require sunshine for vitamin D to strengthen their immune system. Now, why did the government turn people against people? Because they want to distract attention from the murderous and barbaric social murder that they are carrying out right now. The people who are dying now, and this is the confusion they want to try and get in people's mind, because they know people don't necessarily follow every single detail. And so they think they can get away with twisting the minds of sufficient numbers in the population to turn one against the other. And so, why do I say this? Because as the death rates have now in Britain, this is a tiny country. We've got Hubei province has 58 million people. Britain has 65 million people, and yet our deaths in Britain exceed those in Wuhan and in Hubei. I mean, it's just unbelievable. They have 1.4 thousand million people, we have 65 million people, and yet we have more deaths than China. And these idiots are the same people. Michael Gove repeated the same thing this week. China is to blame. China is to blame. If the Chinese hadn't done this, the Chinese hadn't done that, if the Chinese hadn't hidden the information, we had that information. Supposedly the time that this whistleblower informed us, then the time after the WHO was informed, then the time after China clamped down, 2 months before we did. And in all that period, the British government couldn't even manage to buy masks. They're made of, the most simple fabric. They couldn't even be bothered to buy glass shields to protect the ICU staff. They couldn't be bothered to search the world for reagent chemicals that would check whether or not the tests on people work, or whether people are ill or not. They couldn't be bothered to organise pre-ventilators, like stuff that you can use before ventilation. All of this has come about in the last... They admitted it like yesterday. It was said, in the last few weeks we've done so much. In the last few weeks. What about all the time before that? Did they really give a damn? They didn't give a damn. We know they had this herd immunity. Now, herd immunity is a genuine scientific term. It's correct. It is not just some Malthusian concept. But in the British context, it is a Malthusian concept, because they wanted to keep the economy going, and they knew the problem was this. And this is where the big hammer blow comes as far as their lies are concerned. The British economy and the world economy is experiencing a meltdown. In the background, behind all this story about COVID-19 and the deaths and the lockdowns and so on, is simultaneously a global meltdown of capitalism, not caused by the virus. It is the biggest economic collapse taking place around the world today since 1929. And one of the things I've noticed, it's very unfortunate, and I was asked this question a week or two ago, will there be war? Well, one of the most scary things I've noticed is that a lot of people are saying it's the Chinese virus. A lot of people are saying Chinese eat bats. They shouldn't treat animals this way and so on. No, the Chinese don't eat bats. Mistreatment of animals, well, people, I've got pictures from the 19th century. People used to eat cats and dogs in France. We had mad cow disease in Britain. the H1N1, I think it was called, swine flu, that started in America. MERS started in Saudi Arabia. You know, diseases come through various types of zoonotic transference, or various diseases. About 60% of post-Second World War diseases come from zoonotic transference. And, you know, one person somewhere caused it, whether they ate a bat or a pangolin, whether they had a pet, which was a bat or a pangolin, whether they worked in a zoo, whether they visited a cave and a bat shat on their head and they happened to breathe in some of, you know, it doesn't really matter. One person somewhere in the world caught the first case. And from that case, it managed to transfer human to human. Now, we know that. And yet I see lots of people posting and arguing and desperately seeking someone to blame. And that total irrationality has now become very widespread. And this really is as close. If you want to know how it is the Germans were manipulated before the Second World War towards a hatred of the Jews, this is what it is. It's the same as the type of arguments being made about one person somewhere from China who may or may not have eaten an animal that we disapprove of them eating, or that he shouldn't have eaten. And yet this then becomes the Chinese are to blame. And that is, basically it's a form of madness, it's a form of psychosis that is spreading around the population, aided and abetted, by the way, by governments who are trying to find an excuse for their own incompetence. Someone on here, I note, sent a post the other day showing the death rates in various countries since the 1950s. And in Britain, the death rate after 2013 began to rise. And actually the life expectancy in Britain has been frozen or falling in recent times. And that is illustrative of how we've ended up in this crisis, because ultimately, as I said again, I point out again, it's a crisis of a lack of elementary and basic resources. In fact, I watched Governor Cuomo's briefing the other day. I tend to watch these things every day now, and he was on there, sort of almost begging belief. You know, how can it be that we can't make a gown? How can it be we can't make a mask? How can it be we can't make goggles? We can't make screens for doctors? You know, actually, there's many people they print them on a 3D printer. You know, you can buy these things from a DIY shop, an FFP3 respirator to protect a member of staff, and then, as part of their hysterical campaign against the public, to try and blame the public for the social murder they are carrying out, or better said, the social murders that are a consequence of their policies, they now turn around and say, you know, the public are to blame for going to the park, you know. How can you kill someone by going to the park? Unless you're in a group that spreads the cough directly to another person in circumstances which would have to be so close that... you know, that they caught the virus from the other person. And in actual fact, you know, as the weather improves, the sun also has an effect on killing the viruses earlier. The warmer weather also reduces the amount of potential spread. And as I said earlier on, the fact of going out is beneficial for the health, and that improves the resilience of people towards being able to deal with the disease. And also, with the lockdown, you see, there are two elements to this. In a time scale of the escalation of the number of people who will be hospitalized and also die. And the timescales were this, effectively. First phase was not preventing people from large-scale assemblies, gathering in buildings, gathering in tube stations, gathering at the Cheltenham Festival, football matches, clubs, bars, and so on, when they knew what was happening. That led to the number of, pretty much the number of people who are now coming in, getting infected and coming down, or have been in the last 2 weeks. After the lockdown, apart from the gaps that they left behind, for example on the tubes and stuff like that, there were also people who contracted or have contracted the virus in the last 2 weeks as a result of going back to their houses. Now, it was inevitable that they had to do this, but they should have done it much earlier, and then the problem would have been so large. But you see, what you're going to have is you have this rising spike at the moment in the deaths, way, way, way above what China was, and it will keep on rising, perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times as high as the deaths in China. And of course, the way out of that, of course, is to get some journalists to put some rubbish about, oh, in China they're hiding the numbers, in China they're hiding the numbers, they don't tell the truth, and that sort of shit they want you to believe. No matter what matrix you worked upon, no matter what numbers they have invented about how many are supposed to have died in China, just sucked it out of their thumb. The truth of the matter is, even those numbers, even if they were 10 times as many dead in China, it would still be less than we have here as a proportion of the population. So get that. That's how incompetent we are, even though we've got one of the best health services in the world. And then they get nurses to come on, give a little talk, because the nurses are being overworked and they're overstrained and they're in danger. And you get one of them to go on, make a little video and put it out on the BBC or on the Guardian. Stay at home, otherwise we'll all die. That's a lie. Now, in Germany, interestingly, there's a Heiko, I believe his name is. He's from Halle, excuse me, I forgot the name, slightly incorrect. That's one of the virologists, important virologists in Germany. You have Heinrich Streeck. He's now taken over the lead role for the government in the scientific community. And he's from Bonn University. He's a lead virologist there. And they conduct a very large study, or they are conducting studies and have conducted studies in Heisenberg, a cluster outbreak in Germany. And there they found that, interestingly, they found, in contradiction to the arguments that have been given to date by British experts, they don't even tell you anything about anything in Britain, but there's a guy called John Campbell, who's a nurse, or nursing professional, and he has provided some quite good information to the general public, outside of the parameters of what the government has done. And also a number of papers from China and Hong Kong and so on have talked about the viability of the virus on surfaces. And what they did was they collected specimens of the viruses from doorknobs and from mobile phones and keyboards and things like this. And they argued that the viruses can survive for such and such a period of time. However, in Germany, what they did was they tried to cultivate. They didn't just collect them and check if it's a virus. They tried to cultivate the virus to see if it was actually viable to infect someone. And the interesting thing about this was, this week it was broadcast on ZDF in Germany. Heinrich Streeck, that is. He's the lead virologist in Germany at the moment, in the country. Christian Droste, who was he's the guy from the Charité. He found his group invented the initial test for the virus. So in Germany, the discussion is far higher intellectual level, and they don't treat people like idiots. There are different viewpoints, all being expressed, and the public can make up their minds and inform themselves about it. That's also an important part of public health. You need to know what you're dealing with and assume that the general public can have sufficient knowledge about this to make an informed decision about what they do. And in a way, the Swedish experiment is an example of that. It's an example of, treating the public like adults and allowing them to make decisions. But they have advantages in Sweden that a very large percentage of the population live as singles. As 60% of the population, for example, in Stockholm live on their own. And the population is much more scattered. It's not like high-rise blocks everywhere and people live in them. Lots of people live in relatively small blocks of flats, lots of aeration, and so there's less chance of transmission. So the point being that Heinrich Streeck found, and his team found, you could not cultivate live and viable viruses from surfaces, doorknobs, handles, mobile phones, and so on. Now, that therefore means, if it's correct, and now it possibly is not correct, but it's quite a large study they did, and these are very, very serious analysts. They're not just, one doctor examining the possibility of the survival of something in laboratory conditions. This is examining in the real circumstances in which these remnants, these traces exist. And so that also means that it's not necessary to worry too much about picking it up from an object. You touch a last week, for example, when Boris Johnson sent out a letter, I said, well, they might infect you. Well, actually, it seems that that's not the case. But we live and learn, you know. It's perfectly possible to make a mistake and to overestimate the threat in particular environments. It's better for us to learn and then isolate those particular circumstances where you actually can catch the virus. So you can catch the virus inside a building. That's the most likely place you're going to catch a virus. Inside somewhere with someone else, probably sitting with you and talking with you, or coughing or sneezing for about 10 minutes. Now that doesn't mean you couldn't get someone run past you in the park in theory and heavily breathing and breathe right at the moment. You breathe that right in at that second. It's a theoretical possibility, but the chances of it are far, far lower. It's always a scale of chances, isn't it? So is it therefore, because they did this study, Heydrich, does it mean that you could not get it off any object? No. You could, for example, if someone coughs, like Whitty did on the 5th of March at the Health and Social Care Commission, you could cough on your hand, you could shake someone's hand, they could put it in their mouth almost immediately, and you could get the virus. But other than that, you're almost certainly not going to get it off an object. So, and this is what we've learned. This is 3 months of studies that have eventually led to the conclusions about where the most likely possibilities of catching it is. So then we can identify nodes, like the building behind us. If people were working in that building and there were large numbers of people in the building and it wasn't aerated properly, then the possibility of catching the virus in that building would be relatively high. And therefore, you can identify, you can take action, and you can ensure that people are safe when they do re-enter those environments. Now, one thing that was asked of the lead official of the Center for Disease Control in China, and I posted this on my Facebook last week, I believe it was. I'll point to it again underneath the comments for this video. And in there, the lead Center for Disease Control expert in China, he said, he was asked, won't the disease come back in China? Aren't you just pretending that you've got rid of it? It's actually going to come back and hit everybody again and have a new wave. And he said, well, no, we're going to take action quickly whenever any outbreaks occur, so we can contain and control, just as they did in Korea, just as they attempted to do in Singapore. It's come back a bit now in Singapore, and that's probably because not enough people were wearing masks. And the second thing is, it's probably because they do live in quite large apartment blocks, they do live quite densely together. But Singapore is a single city. It's relatively easy for them to monitor, control, contain. Now, in China, they're going to monitor, control, contain. That's why they had to stop it in China. It's such a vast country. Everyone was moving. Hundreds of millions of people were moving at the time when the outbreak took place. And that's what led to the drastic action the Chinese took to contain the virus in the way they did. Now, the thing I was going to say about the insipid thinking, and also the government response, the propaganda response and the censorship, because there is a very widespread censorship now. For example, if you're watching this video, you're almost certainly someone who has been in contact with me in some way or other in the last few months, and also before that, perhaps the previous 6 months. But years ago, when Jeremy Corbyn was first elected or something like that, Facebook was much more open, and therefore if you post something, maybe everyone on your friend group would see it. Nowadays you get maybe 50 or 100 out of 3,000 who will see what you post. And that's because they've carried out a process of social isolation on the internet as well. We're being corralled into particular groupings who are able to connect with each other but not with others. And the consequence of that is that it is also true that conspiracy theories that argue that the virus is something completely different than what it is are proliferating in the underground. When you get an underground, it's almost like the virus, when you get an underground, a suppressed information dissemination or conspiracies being disseminated, they gain a particular force in those circumstances. When you ban people from seeing something, or you try to ban them from seeing something, everybody wants to see it. And then it becomes all the more believable. Now, I can give you some anecdotal and some practical information about that. Anecdotal, well, lots of people who I've encountered, they seem to think that this 5G electromagnetic spectrum wave, which is a sort of microwave, they seem to think that this is responsible for the virus. The argument being, and there are some papers if you look on Google search, you'll find some papers by various people who are claiming, and they are medical papers and scientific papers, which doesn't actually mean all that much, but in other words, someone's got a doctorate and has managed to get their article published. And some of those people, what they argued was that 5G weakens the immune system of a human being, that they rolled it out in Wuhan, and when they rolled it out in Wuhan, it led to the dissemination of the virus. Actually, there are large parts of China where they've already introduced 5G. In Shanghai, they introduced 5G at the same level as they have in Wuhan, yet Shanghai had hardly any infections. Now, that's because it's actually got nothing to do with 5G. And the other countries in the world and the infections. I mean, to argue that that's caused by 5G is just so childish. But it's the conspiratorial mind, because people know the government is lying to them, and therefore many people think, oh, well, I can discount what the government's saying because they're obviously lying. And then, well, there's this underground thing that no one's supposed to know about. 5G is responsible. And some madman went and burned down a 5G tower the other day. So we have this almost like the emergence of an underground terrorist network, effectively, arguing that it's caused by 5G. And unfortunately, some people I know who should know a lot better have been circulating this nonsense on the internet and in their personal circles. The other argument, the New World Order, Agenda 21, all this sort of thing, Bilderberg and that. These type of arguments have been circulating quite a long time, and they just dovetail with this. So what you'll have is someone, for example, a friend of mine posted something this week. It was supposedly a nurse, in other words, someone dressed as a nurse, standing in an office, talking about the non-viability of a virus in external circumstances. And that may well be true, but then they went on, having latched onto one thing that was true, so they've got you in that way. They then go on to the next thing, which is New World Order, clamped down by the regimes around the world, repression of everybody, which also, firstly, it's wrong, New World Order, but second, there is an element to the repression thing, because the governments are trying to overcome a global economic crisis, which corresponds in time to the emergence of the virus. Now, the world was on the brink of a global economic collapse before the virus came. Purchasing Management Index in the United States of America had dropped dramatically below, indicating a recession was due. The world banking system has been in crisis, the debt crisis has emerged, and also the oil powers are in conflict with each other, Saudi Arabia, Russia. The oil price has collapsed, so those countries that are dependent upon the oil price to pay for wages, conditions, living standards and so on, like Russia or Venezuela or Bolivia, these countries have suffered a catastrophic collapse in income. And the consequence of that is that there will be massive social unrest in these countries. Now, some of you might have noticed I had discussions with people from South Africa this week. In South Africa, there is a real danger the virus will spread very rapidly because winter is coming to South Africa. Luckily, at the moment, it's still a bit warmer, but the people who live in the townships live cheek by jowl, and therefore, even with a rate of transmission, which is relatively low, say 1.3, 1.5, 1.7, it can still eventually spread quite rapidly in South Africa because of that. But then, you look around in South Africa, and when I discuss with people from South Africa, you see that, they don't even have washing facilities. They don't have shops that supply them with food. They don't have hospitals where they can go to. They don't have the elementary facilities necessary to be able to impose the type of lockdown that is necessary. In other words, a voluntary, mass, self-organised lockdown. That's what you need. Popular control over the processes so that people do not feel it's imposed on them. And in South Africa, they've killed more people by military action to try and control unrest because the people don't have any food to eat and means to exist. They've killed more people by violent attacks on them than have died of the virus, and this is an outrage. And now the same is true in India. In India, we had the most barbaric scenes where the wealthy elites in Bombay and Delhi and so on, they can house themselves in their apartments and their houses and so on and lock themselves away. But you can't do the same with millions, and 80% of the population of Mumbai live in shanty towns. They live in squalor. And then added to that, you have the caste system in India, whereby the lower caste, the lowest caste, have always been treated like they're some sort of viral carrying monsters, and they're made to clean toilets all day. Some of them are enslaved effectively through debts which their parents and so on have. And the consequence of that, so from their childhood, they're effectively a bonded labour. And then there are migrant labourers who have been leaving the cities in droves. And when they had to leave the cities, they had to desperately try and find some way to get transport to move perhaps 200, 300, 500 or even 1,000, 2,000 miles to get home. And all those routes that these migrant workers had to take were potential transmission belts for the virus into the communities. Now, as I said, it's likely that the rate of transmission will be slower in these countries, but eventually you get to a point where even at a rate of 1.7, 1.8, you're going slowly upwards, and then it begins to escalate as well. And of course, India doesn't have a health system that can cope with that. So, nor does South Africa. And so I argued this week, as I was asked by someone to make a comment on how you could internationally cooperate, and I wrote an article in which I said, well, what you really need is a global task force, like instead of a military army, a medical army that defends the people's health across the entire world and can be used at each spot. I mean, for example, Como this week has been saying, well, New York is the epicenter now, so we need assistance to New York. And that's correct. And 22,000 medics have gone to New York or offered to go to New York to support them. And they've received support from all over the United States in terms of equipment and resources, but also from other countries like China and so on, who've sent ventilators. They sent 1,000 ventilators from China to New York yesterday. And this is the method that needs to be applied. You need to be able to have a mobile units to deal with these crises as they appear, and to facilitate and assist the people in those areas. And then we can reduce these epicenters into much more contained units, reduce the death rate there, stop it from spreading to other places, and in that way we can deal with crises as and when they break out. Because otherwise you will have some countries where you'll have catastrophes take place. Now, there has also been a discussion within the German scientific community who are at the lead of these issues about, for example, questions of what is the actual death rate. You know, if you say that COVID-19 is the decisive issue and then you look for COVID-19, then you may be identifying people who are going to die anyway as dying from COVID-19, and therefore it's a sort of, argument that, there isn't that much of a problem, it's being exaggerated. Well, you can say that in Germany because in Germany they've got the ventilators. You see, we can't say that here because we don't have the ventilators, the masks, and so it's about the capacity of a healthcare system to cope. If the world had the medical facilities of Germany, the public health facilities of Germany as well, by the way, then there would be very, very little problem. It would be like seasonal flu. That's the point. But that doesn't make it irrelevant because most countries don't have those things. And the most pathetic thing, like I said, you had Como on telly, you say, we don't have masks, we don't have gowns, we don't have anything, basically. Now, what does it mean in terms of the crisis of capitalism in general? In 2008, the governments responded to the crisis and intervened to save the banks. This time, they've used the virus as a mechanism for concealing the actions they are taking, giant Keynesian-type measures in most of the advanced capitalist countries, to try and save the banks and the corporate sector. And big corporations have, for example, there was a piece yesterday, I think it was when they were talking about Volkswagen closing down, and the day they announced they were closing down. The day before that, of course, everybody inside the Volkswagen leadership knew they were going to be closing down, and therefore they could gamble on the stock market based on that. And then after that, they could get money from the government to pay for it, So this is the whole game, that the corporate sector is being bailed out once again. And most of the public, even though the governments have offered money for example, people in Britain who are temporarily laid off, or people who are self-employed and this sort of thing, they've offered some finances for people. The proportion of the finances going to the masses, I believe it was 10%. I think Michael Roberts said, he's a famous economist. He runs a blog called thenextrecession.wordpress.com, and on there he made an analysis of the proportion of the money going towards the people as opposed to the money going towards big business. And the overwhelming majority of the money is going towards big business. And yet, it's ironic, because if you look at, for example, Governor Cuomo in New York talking about the problem, he's saying, well, why on earth can't we manufacture masks? He says, we're the richest country in the world, we can't make a mask. And that says it all. And then he's pleading with these companies. He says, we'll pay you. And yet still they can't do it, because capitalism ultimately, and this is where the whole problem comes from, is a system that produces things for profit. And because the National Health Service is not something for profit, at least not in theory, they've been trying to make it into various selling of various arms and operations of it. Because of this, the National Health Service is not treated as the priority, and the private sector is the priority, and the consequences of it are here to see. Now, one final point, I think, because I've said a few things that have been crossing my mind during the week in the usual scatty fashion which they're presented at Speaker's Corner. I'll do some more systematically on the internet during the week, where I'll do some research, and I'll systematically present ideas rather than just talking. And it's the danger of war. The way in which the world has now been turned from, years ago there was the idea of globalization. Everyone was coming together. The world was becoming one. The European Union was expanding. Then came the 2008 crash. Then came the rise of Trump, the rise of Brexit, the rise of Bolsonaro, the rise of Modi, nationalism, what they call right-wing populism, and so on. All this emerged as a consequence of the economic crash of 2008, which led to a long period of sluggish or stagnant growth. And the consequences of that were felt in divisions between people and in people blaming others. Now, how did that manifest itself in this crisis? Well, in this crisis, remember, wasn't it only 2 months ago that Brexit happened? The European Union has collapsed during this crisis. It's disappeared. You might think it hasn't collapsed, but it has. It's completely collapsed. There is no unity in Europe at all. And they impose borders, by the way, in Europe, very stringent borders, when Britain has not. So Britain's actually the pariah on that issue. On the question of taking control of our borders, it's the British who have done nothing, and the Europeans have turned into sort of self-isolating fiefdoms. There's the police over there. Go home. I mean, look at the distance between people here. The guidelines are about social distancing, right? Now, where is there no social distancing here? And yet the police are going around telling people, go home, go home, go home. I mean, we have a national emergency. It's about resources. The police should be putting their resources to the benefit of the people, and that is not what this is about. This is about trying to make out that the rise in deaths are caused by us, are caused by our behaviour. The rising deaths are caused by something that happened weeks ago when the government did nothing to stop mass dissemination of the virus. And the evidence of that is blatantly obvious from what happened with Boris Johnson and co. Now they're wandering around to people now and getting them to just get off the floor. None of the police, by the way, look, none of them are distancing. Look, they're over there having a go at that guy over. All three of them are too close to each other. All three of them. So what are they talking about? What are they trying to teach us? And none of them have got masks on. Not one of them. No masks. And they're chatting to this guy lying on the floor. I mean, get a grip. Now, war. I was talking about war. So you see, the present crisis is about segregation of people. So in India, they're blaming the Muslims. In England, we're blaming the Chinese. In fact, not only England, America, they're blaming the Chinese. You know, one group turns against another. One nation turns against another. One region turns against. In China, to be fair, just to illustrate how bad this is, it's not only British people blaming Chinese. In China, they're blaming the people in Hubei. You know. That's how mad it is. And now, I saw a TV program yesterday from China, and there was this guy, I'm going to ask these police why they are distancing from each other. Anyway, in Hubei, you know, in China there was a TV program, and they were showing that tourists were beginning to come into town, and basically a white guy was with them, and he went up to these Chinese people and they ran away from him thinking that the white guy's got the virus, you know. So that's what it is. Here we have the police. There's no social distancing amongst them. Well, leave them alone, you know. There's nothing wrong with these guys, you know. It's just they're told to do this sort of thing, you know. But it's a complete waste of time. Anyway, so, you know, this turn, one nation against another, one people against another, and in India, for example, one caste against another, one religion against another. All this is laying the foundation for the most virulent rise in nationalism based on sort of psychoses, severe and dangerous psychoses that will develop out of, you know, this type of idea, this type of circumstance we're in, where we're confusing the spread of a virus, which is a health problem and a technical problem about ventilators, with the global economic crisis which is happening simultaneous with that, and will last long after the virus has gone. And there was a piece I published a short piece which Edward Snowden spoke, and he said quite correctly that they have now used the virus as a means of instituting legislative frameworks that undermine pretty much every democratic right that we've ever won. And one of the reasons I'm coming down to Speaker's Corner is so that at least we should have some presence questioning what's going on, because the government is not being questioned by journalists. When they are questioned by journalists, they don't answer. For example, the mask question. I'll come back. One final point on the masks again. I mean, it's just so absurd, so bizarre. Even Donald Trump now has said the medical advisors are saying wear masks. Why wear masks? Because if you've got the virus, you can pass it on. And if you've got the virus and you can pass it on, if you wear a mask, you won't be able to do so. And it also provides a little bit of protection for someone who hasn't got the virus but is confronting someone who has. So these are just self-evident things, but the government again lies about this. It just lies about this. You ask them, should people wear masks, Minister? The journalists ask that, you know, the pliant, pathetic journalists. And then the government minister turns around and says, or the health advisor turns around and says, masks won't help you from getting the virus. Now, it's just like going in a circle. Yes, but the question's not about getting the virus, it's about giving the virus. If you don't know you've got the virus, how can you know that you should mask up? You know, it's just like talking to a brick wall. Talking to a brick wall of idiots. Anyway, that's the report for today. If something comes up that I haven't thought of, perhaps you can mention it to me, and otherwise I'll talk about it later on, perhaps tomorrow or something. No, Brian Barton, why should I be at home? One is, I'm legally allowed to be out. This is my National Union Journalist press card. I'm legally allowed to be out. I'm reporting on what's happening in the world from the most famous location for free speech in the world. So there is a purpose for me being here. And during the Second World War, by the way, and the First World War, people spoke right the way through the war. You know, Lord Soper, the old preacher who used to speak here, one time, there's a famous instance, he was standing there speaking in Hyde Park, and during the Blitz, and a bomb went overhead. It went, Khoo, and he just stopped speaking for a minute. The bomb landed, and he carried on speaking. That is why I'm carrying on at Speaker's Corner, and that's why when you ask me, Brian Barton, you should go home, it's nonsense. You're falling for the propaganda of the government, which is a concealment operation for their own responsibility for the social murder they have been carrying out through their incompetence, through their idiocy, and through their financial interests rising above the interests of public health. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. See you next week, and perhaps before, if I do some videos before that.